Since its invention, the trombone has been called on to fill a number of different musical roles. The symphony orchestra, military band, solo music, chamber music, and jazz all make extensive use of the trombone. The sonic and practical requirements for each of these roles are different enough that performers specializing in a particular musical genre gravitate towards trombones of different designs. For example, today's orchestral trombonist generally prefers to use a large bore, large bell instrument for its stable tone, secure intonation, and ease of projection, while the jazz trombonist typically chooses a smaller instrument more suited for flexibility and ease in the high register. Of course, the modern trombonist rarely stays within the lines of one musical genre. It is quite common for even major symphony players to play pop shows which branch out into jazz, film, and rock idioms. Even if one managed to completely avoid non-classical repertoire, classical solo and chamber music now utilize trombones far more often than before, and they have their own different sonic requirements, often borrowing from jazz. Furthermore, as a result of improved scholarship, the classical realm has itself expanded. For certain works, such as the Mozart Requiem, the Haydn Creation, and the symphonies of Beethoven or Schumann, orchestral trombonists will sometimes use smaller instruments to more closely match the sound the composer was familiar with. This has left the trombonist with two options. They could own multiple instruments, each selected for a specific situation and sound quality, or they could adjust their performance practice on their existing instrument in an attempt to imitate the desired sound. While owning multiple instruments might seem ideal, considerations of transportation and storage often render this impractical, to say nothing of the difficulty in learning to play many different trombones, each with different response, intonation, grip, and weight. The second option, performance practice adjustment, is the simplest and most commonly used solution. Using this approach, the performer uses one trombone, performing music of all styles on it. In order to perform different styles more accurately, the player may alter their style of articulation, air delivery, and tongue position. For instance, a bass trombonist playing jazz on a large bore symphonic instrument might use a stronger articulation with a slightly narrower airstream in the lower range to recreate the bright, edgy sounds of a jazz bass trombone. In any case, a professional trombonist today will typically own one primary instrument that they perform most styles of music on, perhaps with one or two additional instruments of different designs for specialty play or doubling. For most instrumentalists, picking out an instrument is an incredibly personal process, which often involves meeting with instrument designers and playtesting dozens of existing instruments before settling on one in particular. For most of the history of the trombone, however, performers have been limited to a few specific mass-produced designs, chosen mostly by two major manufacturers when picking their primary trombone, and often resorting to expensive and unpredictable custom modifications if the default setups are not satisfactory. In recent years, a number of small boutique trombone manufacturers have emerged, offering what seems to be an ideal situation for this quandary, the modular trombone. With interchangeable bells, slides, valve sections, lead pipes, and tuning slides, these trombones allow the player to more closely customize their instrument to their needs, and even to make changes to their primary instrument without the need for permanent custom work. For instance, if the performer prefers the large bore slide of Bach 42, but the thin wall red brass bell in Con 88H, they could simply select modular parts that match these designs and assemble them into one trombone. Then, if they later had a performance that felt more comfortable on a different bell, say that from a Bach 42, they could simply exchange their current bell for that one. This evening, I will examine a number of designs, both fixed and modular, to demonstrate, first, that the use of different trombone designs by a solo or section trombonist does make a noticeable difference in resultant sound and player comfort, and that this difference can be either detrimental or beneficial based on the musical context. Second, that certain combinations of modular equipment adequately emulate or even improve upon the sound of these different fixed instruments. And third, that it can be reasonably predicted based on objective and subjective measurements of both fixed and modular instruments, which modular parts will result in an instrument with certain characteristics of existing fixed designs. Before delving into the topic of modular trombones, it is first helpful to examine the most commonly used fixed trombone designs to determine exactly what differs between them. There are three main types of trombones in use today: alto, tenor, and bass. Of those, the tenor trombone is the most common and typically what is being referred to when just the generic term trombone is used. The tenor trombone itself has three categories: small bore, medium bore, and large bore. Traditionally, the symphony orchestra employs two tenor trombones, one bass trombone, and one tuba, while the big band uses three tenors and one bass. In orchestra and chamber contexts, the first trombonist usually doubles on the alto trombone rather than playing exclusively. While the designs have varied over the years, instrument builders have, in the last 60 years, settled on certain common design specifications. Alto trombones are usually built with a 7-inch diameter bell and a bore size between 0.48 and 0.5 inches. Small bore tenor trombones will use a similar bore size with a slightly larger 7.5-inch bell. Medium bore tenor trombones will use a similar bore size. Medium bore tenor trombones are built with an 8-inch bell and a slide bore between 0.508 and 0.525 inches. Large bore tenor trombones are almost universally built with an 8.5-inch bell and 0.547-inch bore. Finally, bass trombones use bell diameters ranging from 9 inches to 10.5 inches, with bore sizes ranging from 0.562 to 0.58 inches. It is important to point out that all of the tenor and bass trombones are built with the same length and fundamental pitch, B flat, and as such, function very much the same. The alto trombone is keyed higher in E flat. The differences in bore size and bell design are enough, however, that the instruments feel and sound very different. Since the 1930s, two major manufacturers have emerged offering a range of instruments fitting these descriptions: the Vincent Bach Corporation and the C.G. Kahn Company. Bach released its small bore tenor trombones, the Bach 6, Bach 12, Bach 16, the medium bore Bach 36, and its bass trombone, the Bach 50, all between 1932 and 1938. Bach would not release its immensely popular large bore tenor trombone, the Bach 42, until 1952. Kahn released the small bore 4H, medium bore 6H, and 70H bass trombone all around 1940, adding a large bore tenor, the 88H, in 1954, and a double valve bass trombone, the 62H, in 1968. Besides Bach and Kahn, a few other manufacturers have contributed popular designs over the years that are still in production by their successor companies. The now defunct King Corporation's jazz trombone line, which includes the small bore King 2B and medium bore King 3B, are still manufactured today by the Kahn Company, for example. Each of these designs is still in use. The Bach 42B, Bach 50B, and Kahn 88H are all still widely played by symphony players, and many big band trombonists still prefer the King 2B or Kahn 62H. These designs have remained so popular that virtually every modular trombone sold can be assembled with parts designed to give the player the sound and the feel of these classic models. The fixed instruments that I will focus on this evening are the medium bore Kahn 32H, the large bore Kahn 88H and Bach 42B, and the Bach 50B and King dual gravis bass trombones. It is important to note that while the slide bore among these instruments varies little between models, the materials and bell design are quite different. For example, bells not only come in a number of different sizes, They are made of different metals and alloys, such as yellow brass, gold brass, red brass, or sterling silver, are made with different thicknesses of metal, and even different styles of rim. Some manufacturers will simply bend the end of the bell over a metal wire, known as a bead, while others will actually solder the rim down after bending it to shape. Of the trombones we will be playing tonight, the 32H is the smallest, using a 0.5 and 0.522 inch dual bore slide and a 7.5 inch bell. The 88H and 42B both have 8.5 inch bells and 0.547 inch slide bores. The bass trombones are the largest instruments we'll be playing this evening, with 9.5 inch or larger bells and 0.562 inch slide bores. Note that the con trombones all have unsoldered rims, and the Bach trombones all have soldered rim beads. Two different types of modular trombones will be featured here this evening as well. The tenor trombone setup we will be using is manufactured by Steve Shires, a popular modular trombone and trumpet builder from Boston, Massachusetts. I have selected two different bells and two different slides for use in this setup. The first bell, the 2RVE, is advertised by Shires as the vintage Elkhart model. Elkhart referring to Elkhart, Indiana, where the Con 88H was first produced. Like the bell used in the 88H, it is 8.5 inches wide, has an unsoldered rim bead, and is made out of thin red brass. The second bell, the 7YM, is advertised as being similar to that of the Bach 42B, and like the 42B, it is 8.5 inches in diameter, has a soldered rim, and is made of yellow brass. The slides chosen tonight have one difference: bore size. The standard slide has the customary large tenor bore size of 0.547 inches, while the second slide uses a smaller 0.525 inch bore. The modular bass trombone I will be performing on this evening is my own primary instrument, a bass trombone built by Greenhill Musical Instruments of Elkhorn, Wisconsin. In its standard configuration, it is a stock Bach 50B with a high-quality valve section. I also have 4 additional interchangeable bells, most of which were originally bells removed from fixed trombones. 2 of these bells have been removed from Bach 50B trombones of various designs, the gold brass 50BG bell and the extra-large Bach 50BL bell, which measures 10.5 inches in diameter instead of the customary 9.5 inches. Both have soldered rims, as does the standard 50B bell. The last 2 bells were also made by Steve Shires of Boston, Massachusetts, and were retrofitted to fit my setup. One was the 2RGLW, which is 9.5 inches wide with an unsoldered rim, similar to the bell of the Con 62H, and the unique 2YHW, which is a thick wall, heavyweight yellow brass bell, also with an unsoldered rim. This has no exact fixed design equivalent. The 2 slides being used tonight, again, differ only in bore size. The standard bass trombone slide measures 0.562 inches, while the smaller slide measures 0.547 inches. To illustrate the differences bell and bore can make, let us first start with some examples from the symphonic repertoire. Assisting me this evening in forming an orchestral trombone section are Alex Truelove, Taylor Donaldson, and Olivier Michel Hubert. The Mozart Requiem is likely one of the most commonly performed orchestral works a trombonist will encounter. The orchestration here is quite thin. With a couple of notable exceptions, the trombonist spins the majority of this work doubling the choir parts. Notice that, for this movement, no separate trombone parts were even written. There's just 3 tromboni written next to the choir parts. Therefore, the challenge for the performer in this context is to be heard without overpowering, while simultaneously acting as a tuning mechanism for the choir. Another facet to consider is historical. The trombones of Mozart's day would have been much smaller, and the first trombonist would certainly have performed on an alto trombone. Common practice for these type of works is to have the second trombonist play a medium bore instrument closer in size to a King 3B or a Con 32H, while the bass trombonist might even play the part on a large bore tenor trombone rather than an actual bass trombone. Trombone sections as varied as those of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, the Royal Concerto Orchestra, the Dallas Symphony Orchestra, and the National Symphony Orchestra in the United States all have recently done this. Here we have a social media posting from the Concerto trombones from February of this year, showing off their smaller equipment for a Beethoven 9 performance. Let's listen first to a short excerpt from the Dies Irae, played on this type of setup. I will be playing on a large bore tenor trombone, a Con 88H, while the second part will be played on the medium bore Con 32H. Now that we've got an idea of the sound that we're going for, let's examine the results on some modular trombones. First, let's try this passage again, this time using modular equipment that doesn't match. In this case, the second trombonist will be playing large bore shires with the Bach 42B inspired yellow bell setup and large slide, and I will play my Greenhill bass with the 2 wide heavyweight bell and large slide. As you can hear, this setup doesn't really work that well. It sounds too heavy, too wide, and too loud, and generally requires a lot of effort on the part of the performer. It's likely that a section playing on these trombones would overpower the choir and orchestra quite easily. It is also likely that an alto trombone would be out of balance with the other two players in this context. So let's try this again, with modular equipment that's a little bit closer in size and design to the fixed trombones we played earlier. The second part will be played now on a large bore shires with the vintage Elkhart bell, while I will perform the third part using my Greenhill with the Chu RG LW gold brass bell, still on the large bore slide. While this is noticeably more comfortable to play and to listen to, it's still not quite there. Let's perform this a final time, this time also scaling down the slide rhythm. The second part will now be played on the medium bore tenor slide, while I will perform using the smaller bass trombone slide. While certainly not a perfect replacement for the fixed trombones, it's clear that in this instance, there are certain combinations of modular parts which get the performer closer to the smaller fixed design setup than others. In particular, scaling down the slide bore makes a significant difference from the point of view of both the listener and the performer. Before delving into more orchestral literature, I wanted to take a minute to describe how I arrived at these equipment choices. When deciding which fixed trombones worked best for orchestral playing, I began with historical data. In the case of the Requiem, I began by looking through published measurements of extant trombones dating from early 19th century Vienna. The measurement charts of David Guillaume and Arnold Myers are a good example of such a resource. They list the bore size, bell size, key, length, date of construction, and place of origin of a number of trombones constructed throughout Europe and the US between 1650 and the present day. The trombones of Mozart's era can be described in one word: tiny. The bore size of tenor trombones of the time averaged around 0.425 inches, while the bass trombones averaged around 0.45 inches, both about 0.1 inches smaller than their modern day counterparts. The resulting sound would have been closer to that of the sackbut, thinner, brighter, softer, and more compact. With this in mind, I set out to choose the smallest bore sizes currently available that were still comfortable to play for a player used to modern large bore equipment. In this case, the 0.5 bore of the Con 32H and the 0.547 bore of the smaller bass trombone slide were logical choices, given that they were significantly smaller than the standard large bore tenor and bass trombones, yet still close enough to feel familiar to someone used to playing modern instruments. Once I was satisfied with my fixed design choices, it then became a matter of seeking out the modular equipment most likely to match their fixed counterparts. This is where things begin to get complicated. While manufacturers describe certain parts as inspired by the classic designs, I usually choose to believe my ears over a marketing pitch. Still, listening can be highly subjective, and while it is certainly the most important factor, I also sought out a method of objectively measuring each instrument, not just to support my subjective conclusions, but also as a method for predicting ahead of time which modular combinations might be suitable replacements. Enter input impedance measurements. In these tests, the air inside the trombone is excited over the audible frequency range by a low-powered speaker. Microphones next to the driver capture the resulting response at the mouthpiece, from which details of the resonant frequencies of the instrument and their respective strengths are computed. The device shown here is similar to the system used at McGill, and it operates in the same manner. You can see the mouthpiece attached to the top of the cylinder, and the cylinder contains both the microphone and speaker. The result is a graph which shows a series of peaks, each of which correspond to the frequency of one of the natural notes of the instrument's overtone series, also known as partials. The height of each peak indicates the relative strength or amplitude of each frequency, and the width of each peak indicates the relative damping. Frequencies with lower damping ring longer, have narrower peaks, and usually have a greater amplitude. The strength and placement of each resonant frequency, when compared to a mathematically perfect harmonic series, can potentially reveal a great deal about how an instrument sounds and plays. In a laboratory at McGill's Center for Interdisciplinary Research in Music, Media, and Technology, CERMIT, I tested a number of modular and fixed trombones to determine their input impedance in hopes of comparing the instrument's physical vibration properties. During these tests, a small microphone was placed over the bell to pick up the radiated sound at the other end of the instrument. The results, while not definitive, helped to shed some light on the differences that bell design and bore size make on the resulting trombone sounds. In this example, the input impedance measurements are charted in the upper half of the graph, represented by single lines. The lower line of the graph is a radiated sound transfer function rather than input impedance. This data was generated by the microphone picking up the radiated sound above the bell. Please note that in these graphs, I was unable to label the y-axis with both input impedance and radiated sound transfer function. For the purposes of clarity, only the top lines show input impedance. I plotted the measurements of the Con 32H in the black line alongside that of the large bore yellow bell Shire setup, the red line, and the medium bore yellow bell Shires in the blue line. Note how, as the frequencies get higher, the three lines get further apart. Also observe how, for each instrument, certain peaks have a higher amplitude than others. In this case, the smaller slide bore, in blue, has peaks closer together in both frequency and amplitude to the black line of the 32H than the larger bore slide in red. As such, one would expect the smaller bore Shire slide to sound and feel more like the Con 32H than the larger bore slide. This method is not without its shortcomings, however. First, the testing system vibrates the instrument at a relatively low amplitude compared to pressure levels under real playing conditions, and therefore may not be perfectly analogous to real-world trombone play, which is often at very high pressure levels. Second, I discovered that bell design, by itself, generally showed little to no change in the data, especially if the radiated frequencies picked up by the microphone were not taken into account. For example, here is a plot of just the input impedance measurements of all 5 of my bass trombone bells using the same slide. There isn't very much difference in the data, even though, after play testing each bell with a recording device, I have found there is certainly a difference in both sound and feel between them. Simply put, the input impedance measurement system measures the natural harmonic series of the instrument, and bell design by itself does not affect the placement of the overtone series in the way that bore size and profile do. As such, I found it to be a useful data point, mostly in relation to bore size. Nevertheless, these objective measurements are somewhat useful in predicting which modular combinations were most likely to be suitable replacements for the fixed trombone choices I had made based on the historical data and my own listening. Once I had narrowed down which modular equipment was most likely to work, I then began to play test a few different equipment choices with the other players in the section. Through trial and observation, I determined that the modular trombones that more closely matched the smaller fixed trombones in input impedance measurements did seem to be the most comfortable and best sounding choices for each of these orchestral passages. In the case of Bruckner's 8th Symphony, The desired sound and feel are a polar opposite from those of the Mozart Requiem. The opening of the fourth movement is a perfect example. It is comprised of long fortissimo block chords in the trombones and tuba that must be perfectly in tune and absolutely steady, with no shake or wobble in the sound. The orchestration further exacerbates these requirements, as a Bruckner orchestra is massive, making projection just as important as intonation and stability. Still, the sound must be warm and in control without breaking up or sounding too harsh. Historically, we know that the trombones of Bruckner's time were much more similar in size and design to the trombones being played today. The first two parts would have been played on tenor trombones with a bore size ranging from about 0.524 inches, like today's medium bore trombones, to 0.547 inches, like modern large bore tenors. Bass trombones were already using 0.562 inch bore size, still in use today. With these requirements in mind, let's listen to a set of modern fixed trombones performing the opening of the fourth movement of Bruckner's Eighth Symphony. The first and second trombone parts will both be played on Bach 42B large bore tenor trombones, and the third part on a Bach 50B bass trombone. I've chosen the Bach trombones for their similarity in size to the trombones of Bruckner's day, as well as for their stability and the louder volumes when compared to the con trombones. As you can hear, this piece is powerful, and the choice of instruments made by the trombone section must accommodate that, or risk sounding too shrill. Let us first turn to the input impedance and radiated frequency data to see if it is possible to predict which modular setups might best replace these fixed instruments. First, we have a graph of the two large bore modular tenors, the 7YM and 2RVE, compared to the fixed Bach 42B. You'll notice that, while there are some small differences between the impedance peaks of each of these instruments, they are largely similar in amplitude, frequency, and width. Zooming in a bit closer, you can see that the lower harmonics are almost completely identical, and the higher harmonics are only slightly higher in pitch on the Shire's trombones than on the Bach. In the case of the bass trombone, it happens that my modular bass trombone's default configuration is actually the same set of parts used in a fixed Bach 50B. As such, most of the input impedance measurements of my instrument, compared to a standard 50B, look even more alike than the tenors. In fact, they appear almost identical. In this instance, the objective data proves to be less useful than in the Mozart. Therefore, we are left to subjective means of determining the best modular trombone for the job. In this particular case, after careful consideration of the resulting sound via recording device, as well as the feeling of each instrument, I was able to find a set of modular trombones that sounds and feels pretty close, as well as a few configurations which are not appropriate in this context. To demonstrate, we will now play the same passage on incorrect modular setups, using similar equipment to what we previously used with great success on the Mozart for the second and third parts. For the purposes of this demonstration, the first trombone part will be played on a medium bore modular tenor trombone, since this is not an alto trombone part, and the second part will be played on a large bore modular tenor trombone. With this particular set of trombones, it becomes quite clear that the long set of modern modular trombones can be a clear step backward in tone quality, intonation, blend, and balance. Note how much the sound breaks at the louder dynamics on the smaller instruments, often accompanied by faulty intonation and unstable sound. So let's make some adjustments. First, let's change the slide bore to something more appropriate by switching the first part to a large bore tenor slide and the bass trombone to the large bore bass slide. This is a significant improvement, and it is certainly easier to play. However, we can get even closer to the desired sound by matching the bells as well. For this final demonstration, the top two parts will be played on large bore Shire's trombones, each with a bell similar to that of the Bach 42B. I will perform the bass trombone part on my modular bass trombone with the heavyweight Shire's 2YHW bell, touted by Shire's as being geared towards the orchestral player. As you can hear, the sound was much closer to that of the fixed trombones we first performed this passage on. The intonation was more accurate, the tone was more stable, and the volume level was somewhat louder, yet the sound did not shatter or get out of control. In the case of the bass trombone, I found that the heavier weight bell actually allows me to play a little louder without sounding out of control than even on my standard Bach 50B. Now that we've examined the possibilities modular trombones present in regards to ensemble playing, let us turn our attention to solo playing. Unlike many other orchestral instruments, there's very little solo literature for the trombone, and far less amongst literature written prior to the mid-20th century. As such, we generally have to rely upon transcriptions of works written for strings, woodwinds, and voice if we wish to play quality music from the Baroque, classical, and Romantic periods. In contrast to the orchestral literature, which has very specific sonic requirements based on historical performance practice and ensemble needs, solo literature allows the performer the freedom to tailor their sound to their own artistic preferences. Generally speaking, when I am selecting the equipment for each piece, I am looking for the instrument that feels the most comfortable to play, while still sounding appropriate for the work. My intended sound is determined from a combination of historical performance practice and practical considerations, such as accompaniment style, balance, range, etc. Determining what feels and sounds good for solo works involves mostly self-observation. In the practice studio, I perform a segment of the work I am preparing with the video and audio recorder running. I generally try every possibility available to me, making detailed notes on how each setup feels when compared to my standard Bach 50B. Does it articulate more easily? Does it seem to require more air to maintain tone? Is it a more direct sound that's more difficult to hear from the performer's point of view? Or is it a more diffuse sound that I can hear more easily from behind the bell, that perhaps doesn't project the same way. All of these notes are then compared to the results from the audio and video. In terms of relating these feelings to objective data, I found that input impedance was, in certain specific cases, a good way to predict which setups would more closely match the sound and feeling I was after. For instance, with the Bozza New Orleans, I want to sound like a jazz-based trombone. Therefore, I would begin my experimentation in the practice room with the instrument that has the most similar input impedance measurements to the jazz-based trombone that I have access to. In this particular case, the King Duo Gratis. Once I have all of this information gathered, I use it to assemble the modular trombone, which I believe sounds and feels the best for the work at hand. Tonight, I present 4 different solo works, each with very different sonic requirements and technical challenges, and each performed on a different configuration. The first solo work I am performing this evening, the Sonata of Telemann, is a good place to start. This Baroque solo piece, as originally conceived, would have been performed on an early version of the bassoon, which has a light, airy tone, capable of clean, quick articulation and long phrases. Here's a short example of this work performed on a period bassoon with continuo accompaniment. Imitating this particular tone on a bass trombone is a largely impossible task, but, as with any transcription, perfect authenticity is not the concern here. What I'm looking for is an instrument with a small, clear, direct sound, like an early bassoon, that is also easy to play lightly. I found, after recording both audio and video, as well as my observations of feeling and response, that the bells with the soldered rims met my requirements for clarity and quick response more efficiently than the unsoldered rim bells. I also determined that the transparent quality I sought was most easily achieved using yellow brass rather than gold brass. The input impedance data graph, however, does not seem to support or refute these findings, as there is very little difference between the impedance measurements of each bell. Here we have my standard Bach 50 bell, my baseline, compared to the 2 unsoldered rim bells, one made from yellow brass and the other made from gold brass. While there is some difference between the resonance sound readings in the lower frequencies, this should not be seen as significant, as ambient room noise often contaminates the readings in this frequency range. My own recording and observation has led me to prefer the standard Bach 50B bell on my modular setup when performing this sonata. I find that the soldered, lightweight, yellow brass bell allows me to articulate more sharply without sounding thuddy or woofy, particularly in the lower dynamics that this work demands. Now I'd like to invite to the stage my accompanist, Katherine Petersen. After I will perform, we can sing before the Telemann. One of the oldest traditions among trombonists is the relation of the sound of the trombone to the sound of the human voice. The teaching methods of Johann Rochu, Emery Remington, Arnold Jacobs, and Charles Vernon all revolve around the concept of trombonist as singer in regards to air support and phrasing. It is from this tradition that I have been inspired to myself transcribe 4 songs from Schumann's song cycle, Dichterliebe, for bass trombone and piano. When selecting equipment for this piece, I wanted to sound quite different than what I achieved with the Telemann. The staple of romantic lieder requires a sound that is thick and resonant, with easy connections between the notes. While articulation does need to be clean, I am not looking for the same pointed quality that the Telemann requires. Again, when comparing bells using input impedance, there isn't a lot in the data that suggests a difference between bells that fulfills these particular requirements. Using my 50B as a baseline, I was looking for evidence that one bell sounded and felt heavier and more covered than the others. However, nothing in any of these graphs suggested this. Therefore, I was left to recording and playtesting. My own process of recording myself and documenting my comfort when performing this work showed that using the heavy, unsoldered rim 2YHW bell resulted in a dense sound with a more covered articulation. I also found that the heavy bell, since it feels less responsive, actually encourages me to use a thicker and more connected airstream. As such, I find that the heavyweight unsoldered bead 2YHW bell is a good choice for Schumann lieder. bass trombone concerto of Robert Spillman is one of the earliest pieces of solo literature written for the bass trombone specifically, and as such has become a staple in our repertoire. This work alternates between fast, loud, angular passages and soft, long, lyrical phrases. It also utilizes a much wider range than that of the Telemann or the Schumann, descending as low as pedal E in both slow and fast sequences. Therefore, I am looking for a setup that is easier to play in the lowest tessitura, yet still capable of the cleanest articulation available. In the practice room, I found that the larger bell, the 50BL, seemed to work better than the others, particularly in the low pedal register. The input impedance data does, in this case, offer a small possible explanation for why this might be. On this graph, comparing the 50B, 50BG, and 50BL, there is little to no difference in the lower harmonics, while the damping of the higher harmonics is higher and the amplitude of these harmonics is lower. In this case, it could be inferred that the larger bell geometry is resulting in softer, less resonant, higher overtones. This could help explain the darker, less edgy tone this bell provides. As I hope will soon be apparent, the larger bell allows for a rounder, more diffuse tone with a low and pedal range that is significantly easier than on the smaller bells. Like the 50B, it maintains a soldered ring bead, giving me precisely what I want for this work, a rich, complex sound with easy articulation and a vibrant low tessitura. Violins by Eugene Bozza is a work thoroughly steeped in jazz. As such, I wanted a tone as close to the modern American jazz bass trombone as I could find. In this case, I decided once again to go with a modular instrument similar to that of a fixed trombone. In this case, the King Duo Gravis. The technical demands of this work are extreme. The range is from pedal F all the way up to high B flat, a 3.5 octave range. The articulation required runs the full gamut from quick, secco 16th notes peppered with random accents to sloppy, glissando-laden lyrical passages. The dynamic demands are also quite varied. I will be playing both as softly and as loudly as I ever would in a solo context. To give you an idea of the sound I'm looking for here, I'll perform the opening of New Orleans now, a little bit of it on an actual King Duo Gravis. It should be said that I have no exact modular setup that is built in the same way as the one I just played. Therefore, the input impedance data becomes more useful. This graph is a comparison of the input impedance measurements of an actual King Duo Gravis with those of each of my bells. In this case, the Shire's 2R-GL-W bell, which has a lightweight unsoldered rim and is made of red brass, comes slightly closer, both in actual placements of harmonic frequencies as well as amplitude. Indeed, my findings in the practice studio match quite closely to this data. This thin wall bell allows me to get both the fuzzy soft tones of a trombone ballad as well as the out of control, over the top, loud and high play typical of a commercial or big band player that this work calls for. Before I conclude with this final work, I wanted to take a second to thank a number of people involved in making this recital possible. First, my teachers, James Box and Pierre Baudry, for years of lessons and feedback. Dr. Gary Scavone for the use of the Kermit Labs and his invaluable expertise in the areas of acoustics, programming, and instrument design. Professor Andrew Dunn and Dr. Eleanor Studley for their invaluable guidance. My fantastic accompanist, Katherine Petersen, Maximilian Brisson, Thomas Burton, Sarah Carbonneau, Raymond Carruthers, Aaron Chan, Taylor Donaldson, Alexis Grant-Lefebvre, Anne-Marie Loom, Isabelle Lavoie, David Leroux, David Martin, Hilary Sims, and Alex Truelove for allowing me to use your instruments for testing and tonight's demonstration. Michel Hubert of Twig Music for the retrofitting work on my bass trombone bells, Graham Middleton of the Schulich Corporation for providing the bell mounting hardware, and of course, last but not least, my wife Anne-Marie and my new son Simon for patiently supporting me throughout this long process. Thank you all for coming this evening, and without further introduction, Bozza's New Orleans. committee as well as the audience.
I'm going to shout from here, I think. Thank you, Andrew. It was a brilliant lecture recital. We need to have 2 rounds of questions from the 4 committee members. I don't know who wants to go first. Do you want me to dive in or James, who to start? And then we'll open the floor to any questions in the room from the audience. Me, shall I go first?
Sure, maybe.
Should I go first? Sure. Okay. So, I wasn't sure how to frame this question, but I think I put it during the... There's so many instrument variables in the modular system. Do you think it possibly restricts performance practice or enhances the use of it? And if it restricts it, what would be your preferred teaching method? Would it be to start with one system, teach performance practice, or would you teach it over
I think I understand what you're asking. You're asking if, from a teaching perspective, if...
Well, it was interesting. It was interesting really looking at all the different variables. I actually think it's possible to learn a lot more. But if you're going to teach someone, what do you want to teach?
I agree that it opens up many more possibilities as opposed to restricting them. If I'm teaching a student, my approach is going to be similar to my own, which is to have, even though I've got a modular horn, I've got one set of equipment for it that is my baseline. In my particular case, it's the Bach 50B, straight out of the box setup, on a modular horn. Like all the parts are stock Bach 50B. I would most likely advise any student I was teaching to, even though they've got all these possibilities, there needs to be a home base that they come back to. But when they've got that, it becomes a lot more obvious to the listener and the player when they're using equipment that deviates from home base. And I think opens up the performance mind a bit and allows them to more clearly see the possibilities when they've got a baseline to judge them all by.
We did the measurements quite a while ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering if you have a chance to do more measurements, what might you explore? We had a lot of issues there where you didn't necessarily see differences between horns you thought you might. So just wondering what you might sort of tackle.
If I had this to do over again, I would focus much less on bell and much more on different slide bores. There's a number of combinations of slide bore out there that I didn't get a chance to test, either by not having access to them or just simply not having enough time. I would probably test a number of dual bore slide options, which we did have one fixed horn here, where the first tube is smaller than the second. I would also examine the bore of the crook of the trombone, because there's a number of variables by brand, even within the same modular maker of crook bore. In some cases, they'll build a slide with they'll build a tenor trombone slide, but it put an oversized bass trombone crook on it to, as they say, open it up. I would focus much more on bore and bore profile than I did on bells, and I think I would get data that was much more meaningful.
You hear differences between different bells, though, right?
I certainly hear and feel differences between the bells. I just couldn't find any data that showed very much difference. It was much more useful when it came to bells in finding out what was more similar, to find a modular instrument that was more similar to a particular fixed setup. It didn't, the things that I saw on the graphs with different bells, I mean, they looked practically identical, so they didn't really correspond to the things that I was hearing and feeling. I believe we discussed that was a lot to do with the rather low pressure and low amplitude of the measurement tool.
Yeah, I mean, we could have experimented with different microphones
Absolutely. In fact, when we were rehearsing the section portion of this, we did a lot of trial and error with the other performers I was working with in this particular case for different pieces of equipment. A number of different trombonists, the two that I worked with here in particular, were a pretty valuable source of feedback in that regard.
So I'm trying to get a sense of whether people agree or there's maybe a lot of disagreement amongst players, each person has their own.
I'm sure you could ask Taylor and Alex about this, but we strangely didn't have much disagreement as to what did and didn't work, particularly in the section stuff. I think a lot of it was establishing our baseline with the fixed instruments. It was easy for us to tell which setups felt and sounded closer to, to that baseline. And so we didn't have a lot of disagreement on that, no.
Pass it on to another committee.
You already partially answered my first question, so I had to think of something else to ask. But no, I actually, along the line of what I was going to ask was that you did not change the slide throughout your solo playing.
Correct.
And so in terms of duplicating fixed setups with modular, we're not totally duplicating that. However, other than the fact that you don't have, didn't have the resources to have 5 different slides available. If you did, would you change the slides, and why? And I guess I'm kind of baiting you by also asking in terms of the feeling of playing the instrument. How much did you find in terms of playing the different instruments, in terms of having to adapt, air, articulation, whatnot? Was that a struggle for you? I mean, how did that work for you?
Well, it actually is that very struggle, which is the reason why I would probably be very reluctant to change slides for solo literature. One thing that did show up in the scientific data was that when the bore size and profile changed, the intonation of the instrument changed. And that makes solo playing a much dicier affair if all of the notes are in different slide positions than what you're expecting. If I did have more resources for playing different slides and more time to become familiar, basically if I had all the resources and time that I wanted, I would have used a smaller slide on the Telemann, probably, and all of the rest of them I would have stayed on my standard bass trombone slide. Just simply because